Welcome to CMMCCon 2024. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us today. My name is Julie Millay. I'll be guiding you through today's sessions. CMMCCon 2024 picks up where last year's conference left off, featuring industry experts and practitioners offering actionable strategies for CMMC compliance. CMMCCon will focus on navigating the compliance journey that small and medium-sized contractors face. During the day, be sure to visit the booths, breakout rooms, and download the Defense on the Brink, The Perilous State of Cybersecurity Across the Defense Industrial Base ebook. It features findings from the third annual CyberSheath's Commission survey by third-party researcher Merrill Research. Don't miss the opportunity to take part in one of today's 2 trivia games and be one of 2 winners that will get a Bose portable speaker. This morning, we kick off with a session that highlights the alarming state of cybersecurity across the DIB. During this session, we will share results from a CyberSheath's Commission survey by third-party researcher Merrill Research, as well as how organizations can be prepared for upcoming mandatory requirements. Next, Julie Bracker, partner at Bracker & Marcus LLC, will dive into the impact of the False Claims Act on the DIB. Followed by Kelly Mullins, Vice President of Global Operations at Edge Case Research, joining us to celebrate the critical role of cybersecurity on national security when working as a DoD contractor. Finally, Bailey Bickley, the Chief of DIB Defense at the National Security Agency's Cybersecurity Collaboration Center, will share how the NSA is delivering intel-driven cybersecurity solutions across the DIB, taking us to midday. Now, let's get the day started. Our first session will be a presentation by Eric Noonan, CyberSheath's CEO and founder. CyberSheath is recognized as the leading managed CMMC compliance company with experience that stretches back to 2008, when what we now call CMMC started as a voluntary pilot program. In his former position as BAE's Systems Chief Information Security Officer, Eric Noonan was one of the very first members of the Department of Defense pilot program to secure their commercial supply chain and testified before the House Armed Services Committee subcommittee on how those efforts would impact defense contractors. 16 years after that voluntary pilot program kicked off, contractors are eager to understand how they compare to their peers. To get CMMCCon started, Eric will share some of the insights gained from the CyberSheath's Commission survey by independent third-party Merrill Research. You won't want to miss the eye-opening picture the survey paints of the current DIB compliance landscape.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Julie. I am very excited to get right into this year's update of what now has become an annual exercise for us in surveying the defense industrial base with our independent research partner, Merrill Research. And so this year, the title of our presentation and the findings of this independent research is Defense on the Brink and the Perilous State of Cybersecurity Across the Defense Industrial Base. So we're not burying the lead here. I think that what you'll take away from this presentation is where is the DIB relative to CMMC compliance and therefore cybersecurity generally. And so very excited to go through this data. There is an ebook that you can download here at the venue today to get the kind of full version of these results. So let's get right into it. So as I mentioned earlier, this is become an annual exercise for us. There's a lot of pontification on LinkedIn and other forums about CMMC and the DIB and cybersecurity and a lot of opinions. So about 3 years ago, we decided we wanted to find out the truth, and that would be a better guide for us. We obviously here at CyberSheath have a tremendous amount of experience relative to implementing the cybersecurity maturity model certification controls, NIST 800-171, DFAR 7012. That's our life. That's all we do. But we wanted to look beyond our own experience with the defense industrial base. So in 2022, many of you will remember that we launched our groundbreaking study surveying the defense industrial base and relative to their ability to meet the controls required by CMMC, and where they were relative to adhering to DFAR's requirements for completing a system security plan, an SSP, completing plan of action and milestones, a POAM, completing SPRS submissions. Where were we? And so we've continued to update this research on an annual basis. But the question we wanted to answer this year in 2024 was, would larger defense contractors with more resources show better results relative to CMMC compliance as part of an expanded sample size? So this year we went to larger companies with 1,000 or more employees and tried to open the aperture and understand, is bigger better? And would we find that those companies with more assets, more resources, be deploying those resources towards cybersecurity in a more meaningful way, and then therefore show greater levels of CMMC compliance? And so that was the focus, building off prior year's research, but that was really the focus for this year. So the objective, again, was determine the state of CMMC compliance across the defense industrial base. The data was acquired for part of an online survey collected in April 2024 to include interviews and a pretty robust methodology employed by Merrill Research. We were completely out of the kind of research and didn't influence the results in any way. The audience surveyed as part of the study included individuals throughout the DIB working at businesses inside the defense industrial base who have DFARS obligations in their current contracts, are responsible for cybersecurity, and are actively seeking CMMC compliance. So we should be right in the bullseye for the folks who are at this conference today and what you're all interested. So it's part of an ongoing study, obviously, to better understand the state of the DIB and the state of CMMC compliance in the DIB. So as I said earlier, we expanded the research this year to include a broader range of contractors with up to 1,000 employees and understand, again, is bigger better? So they had to have a DFARS obligation, 40 to 1,000 employees. And the folks that we talked to, we'll get into the kind of the roles and responsibilities and where they fell. Again, if you remember some of the prior research, I always like to say the sun never sets on the Department of Defense supply chain. You can see the diversity in the research results and the regions and where the folks who responded, where they were based. It's pretty evenly spread throughout the country. Obviously, we could, and maybe that'll be a future expansion, we could have done this globally, and I think you would have seen it is in fact true. The sun never sets on the Department of Defense supply chain. So respondents included C-level owner-operators, managing directors, and then analysts, engineers, and technicians, the folks actually implementing the requirements. As mentioned, the number of employees in the bottom left went from 40 up to 1,000, pretty evenly spread across those larger groups, 250 all the way up to 1,000. And then the industry type, the DIB is so diverse. I mean, it's everything from janitorial services to munitions makers, tool and die manufacturers. There's just such diversity within the defense industrial base. And you can see that in the industry type: manufacturing, construction, architecture, retail, trade, sales. All of these slices of that pie chart you see there. For us, as we saw the data here at CyberSheath, it was really interesting because that's our customer base. It is so diverse. It is all defense contractor, prime, and subcontractors, but very diverse within that. And then finally, what did the responsibility look like for these defense contractors? And what we found is that only 5% of respondents considered this a shared responsibility. 95% had this as a sole responsibility. That is pretty stunning. I think the cliche is very much true that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility, and so that was pretty interesting finding. And clearly, an army of one can't do this and can't meet the compliance requirements. So pretty interesting finding there, but just wanted to give you, again, as we start to kind of set the table here, these are the folks that Merrill Research talked to on our behalf. So as we look at the profile of the companies, next way, oftentimes we think of defense contractors in terms of employee size, what are they doing? Manufacturing, transportation, et cetera. What are they doing in the DIB? And then obviously revenue, right? How big is the company? Is bigger better? Remember, that's one of the questions we're trying to answer this year. And so as you look at the revenue size, anywhere from $500,000 of revenue all the way to north of 25 million. So pretty broad set of kind of respondents there relative to revenue. And then what kinds of contracts were they? Were they subcontractors, both prime and sub, or prime contractors only? And so you can see 89% of respondents had prime contracts, 20% had prime and subcontracts, and 31% were subcontracts only. Important in the sense that we know the CMMC requirements apply to effectively all of the DIB if you have that contract requirement, because that has to be flowed down to subcontractors. As we look at, do we have the right kind of respondent profile? If you look at the bottom right of the screen there and you see they had to have the DFARS clause within their contracts, and that could be DFARS 252, 204, 7019, 7020, 7012, or 7021. And you can see that there. So we really made sure we were talking to the right people, not people who aspirationally were looking to get into the DIB, but these are the folks that are in the defense industrial base actively as a prime, sub, or both today. So what we found was a call to action. The evolution of CMMC, it's been talked about for a long time now, 4 years, depending on when you start counting. And long before that, if you go all the way back to DFARS Clause 7012, which is nearing a decade of kind of existence, it's in well over 1 million contracts. And so it's pretty stunning when you look at the levels of compliance, for lack of a better term, at this point. And so what we found is that the majority of contractors just simply don't have the people, processes, and technologies in place to meet the minimum cybersecurity compliance requirements to do business with the DoD. However, that's not stopping anybody from doing business with the DoD. When CMMC starts to be enforced, that narrative may change. But there was a real disconnect between the belief about the ability to be compliant and the reality of where some of these businesses really actually were relative to compliance. And so more than 7 in 10 respondents claim to be compliant based on their self-assessment. So they've gone back, they've looked at their people, processes, and technologies, and they believe that they're compliant. However, when reporting compliance through SPRS, Supplier Performance Risk System, the score was among respondents was -12 out of 110. So a very strong belief of compliance, but when submitting their work, kind of show me your work, claiming non-compliance. And so what we saw was really a lack of certainty about the requirements, but very confident that they meet them. So if you look at that last statement, just spend a minute with that. DIB respondents seem unsure about the cybersecurity requirements, but are very confident that they meet them. That disconnect has to be, that gap has to be closed. Over 75% of respondents, again, claim compliance based on their self-assessment, but less than 40% are actively working on SSPs, POAMs, or any of the required controls or any ongoing compliance plans. Now, you might say, well, that's because 75% think they're already compliant. But again, the SPRS score that we're seeing, the average score, is -12 out of 110. So again, a great disconnect there. Only 40% of contractors reported submitting an SPRS assessment, and only 4% believe their company is completely ready for CMMC certification, despite 75% claiming compliance. So there really is a big disconnect there. And I think there's probably a lot of underlying reasons for that. As I talk to customers every day, all day, every day, I think what we see is it's almost like trying to learn 3 languages, right? You have the IT piece of CMMC compliance, the cybersecurity piece of CMMC compliance, and then the regulatory piece of CMMC compliance. So it's pretty overwhelming. We're going to get to that, some of the respondent results later today that I'll share around the complexity and the understanding of the actual requirements. So again, 75% defense contractors surveyed rated themselves as compliant via their self-assessment. 23% were compliant via a DoD medium or high assessment, and 1% not currently compliant with the deadlines. I've mentioned the -12 SPRS score, the average Supplier Performance Risk System score. So as you look at the bottom right of the screen, the DFARS contract obligations completed, think about things like system security plan, plan of action and milestones, SPRS score, all those kind of blocking and tackling things that make up compliance. You can see the percentages of the respondents and kind of who had what. Who had an SSP? 52% of respondents. Who actually submitted an SPRS score? 41% of respondents. Who's doing an actual annual incident response exercise? Only 42% of respondents, but 76% have actually rated themselves as compliant via a self-assessment. Pretty interesting disconnect there. So the gap between self-assessment and true compliance seems to continue to widen. So again, as we look at kind of the compliance spectrum, right? 110 if you're fully compliant, meeting all the requirements, that's the fully compliant score, to negative 203 if you're essentially not implementing any of the controls. So within that spectrum, for those who kind of aren't familiar or haven't done the SPRS assessment, that's the kind of range of scores, and we saw again negative 12 as the average. Suggesting a significant opportunity for improvement. So if you're at negative 12 and you have to get all the way to 110, there's a lot of ground to make up there. And what was really interesting about the respondents, as we went deeper into the profiles and dug a little bit deeper, 89% of the companies represented by the survey operate in critical infrastructure sectors defined as the DoD as sectors whose assets, systems, networks are considered so vital that their ineffectiveness or destruction would have debilitating effect on security, national economic security, or public health or safety. So this is a very important group of companies that we're speaking to, and are saying that they're nowhere near where they need to be relative to full CMMC compliance. So as we continue to kind of peel back the onion and look a little bit deeper at the survey results, if you orient yourself to the left-hand side of the screen, we asked all the respondents about a variety of different solutions. Sometimes depending on who was being interviewed, you could get pretty deep from a technical perspective and start to talk about things like DLP or security information and event management, a SIM solution, or endpoint detection and response. And what was really interesting about this is that the top three most adopted security solutions were DLP, IT configuration management solutions, and SIM products, security information event management. What you don't see on the list is multi-factor authentication, which in this day and age, kind of in the amount of breaches that we've seen and the root cause in so many cases being the lack of multi-factor authentication, is pretty stunning. You see that only 21% of respondents have actually implemented a multi-factor authentication solution. Vulnerability management solution, 21%. I won't read through all of these, but it's pretty stunning. Look at patch management, 15% of kind of current deployment levels. These are foundational things. Like if you think about kind of an analogy maybe in the real world, this is like eating healthy and getting some exercise kind of things. These are foundational to longevity. These controls, or these technologies rather, are foundational to just good basic cybersecurity. And you can see very low implementation rates. Then on the right-hand side of the screen, we tried to understand the awareness of the defense industrial base relative to DIB audits, as they're referred to. And so it was aware, not aware, or just didn't submit SPRS scores. And so you can see the understanding of the ramifications and the penalties for inaccurate reporting for SPRS scores, loss of DoD contract eligibility, loss of current DoD contracts, financial penalties, or whistleblower compensation, which we'll get to that a little bit later today. In one of the sessions, we've got a wonderful session with an attorney who's going to walk us through really whistleblower complaints as they apply to cybersecurity compliance for defense contractors. So hope you're able to join us for that. So there is definitely a pretty meaningful awareness to the ramifications for non-compliance. And then on the left-hand side, you see, but a very low level of implementation to address those risks. So what are the obstacles in the path to compliance? Well, we talked about this a little bit earlier, the difficulty in understanding DFARS. And so approximately 40% rated DFARS in 8 out of 10 or higher in terms of difficulty. As I mentioned earlier, in terms of understanding the requirements, I think everybody in this audience who has made any progress on their journey to compliance understands there is a level of subjectivity to these requirements, and there is a technical, there is a control, compliance, IT, cybersecurity. Again, there's a lot to understand and bring all together into to scalable compliance. And so we saw 8 out of 10 respondents rate this as highly difficult. Cost implications, you hear it all the time. There's obviously tremendous amount of discussions around the cost and the cost of implementation. And so over 50% of respondents highlighted significant cost impacts due to ongoing changes in necessary tools and solutions. So again, a little bit of a dichotomy in terms of the idea that this has been in contracts for nearly a decade, well over 1 million contracts to date, but just now starting to see the ramifications relative to cost, and obviously that's because the audit regime is soon to come online. And then implementation hurdles. Many contractors are struggling to achieve and maintain compliance because the dynamic nature of the requirements as it relates to their business. So rolling out multi-factor authentication for remote users is one thing. Doing it for internal users when they log into the desktop, there's technical change, there's cultural change, there's policy and documents that need to be updated. So putting it all together in terms of a coherent implementation package is a pretty meaningful hurdle, is what we found out for most of the respondents. So then we started to think about, well, let's talk to respondents about the awareness of risk. Perhaps the low levels of actual technology implementation or actual compliance are because of a lack of awareness around cyber risk from a cyber incident. As you can see from the results here, that doesn't appear to be the case when 80% of respondents have experienced a loss from a cyber incident. So 20% of the lucky few who have never experienced a loss from a cyber incident or didn't attribute it to a cyber incident. So it doesn't appear that the respondents and the defense industrial base is unaware of the risk. So then again, unpacking then, is it a complexity and a difficulty? Is this just too heavy a lift for companies? And we look at the challenges, and you can see the question we use in the bottom right. And so using a scale of 1 to 10, we asked respondents, how difficult has it been for you and your company to understand how to achieve and maintain CMMC compliance? And you can see that more than 60% of respondents rated the difficulty as a 7 out of 10 or higher. So the defense industrial base believes this is a pretty difficult mountain to climb. And so that tells you a number of things, and perhaps explains the reason for the lack of progress towards actual compliance or even just better cybersecurity hygiene. So as we start to unpack the challenges a little bit, and we kind of tie that back to the level of preparedness for actual CMMC certification, there's a lot of data on this slide, relative to understanding the requirements. How challenging was it? Understanding the verbiage. One of the challenges is IT has their lexicon, security has their lexicon, the regulatory requirements in DFARS and NIST have their own lexicon or language. Creating documentation, routine reporting that's required, audit support. You can see how those break down in the results there. But what it really boils down to, the takeaway from this slide, is that on average, only 4% of respondents believe they are completely ready for CMMC certification. So again, you put CMMC into your browser, as Steve Shirley said, interviewed him, I think, a year or two ago. He was at the conference. And Steve Shirley said, you put CMMC in your browser and your browser will explode these days. So despite all of the information out there and all of the resources free, like this conference today, and all that's being done to try and help defense industrial base contractors, primes, and subs, over the last 4+ years, only 4% believe they are completely ready for CMMC certification. Pretty sobering statistic, given where we are on the doorstep of these audits being real. So cost always comes up relative to the cost of CMMC compliance. We've done webinars in the past, and we've really tried to peel back the onion and kind of show folks what it costs to do this yourself, and use some real numbers, not the DoD budgetary numbers that they've shared throughout the rulemaking process, but based on our experience. And so as we talk about cost with the respondents in the survey, 73% indicated that the cost of tools, solutions, and features had a significant impact. No surprise there. Maybe the surprise is that it's not higher. 27% weren't concerned with the cost relative to tools, solutions, and features. One of the things that we thought was really interesting is the annual budget that respondents had to achieve or maintain DFARS compliance. The mean was $41,220. Woefully inadequate. Now, we've seen some vendors out there that are just astronomical relative to kind of what they're charging for implementation and licensing and ongoing management. So I know there is a spectrum, right? But the $41,000 range would have to be for a pretty small company, because if you look at just fulfilling the ability to monitor your network 24/7, respond, centrally collect logs, respond to incidents within 72 hours, report them to DC3, just that requirement alone, we've shared again in that webinar I mentioned previously, a 30 to 50 person company just to meet that requirement would spend $144,000 a year if they were doing it internally. It can be done much less expensively with the trusted partner if you bring on someone to kind of manage the whole problem for you. But internally, you're talking about a minimum of 8 FTEs, full-time employees, 24/7, monitoring the network. Then you get the tooling costs. And so it's a pretty conservative estimate. That's why this is, I think one of the things about cost is the realization that the right partner can be a force multiplier in terms of meeting these requirements. But to do it internally, again, we've got a pretty detailed webinar. We've walked through that before. And if you reach out to sales@cybersheath.com, I'm happy to send you that link if you're trying to unpack this and do it internally. One of the reasons we do this research, we do this conference, is to get the information out there so you can make the choices that are best for your business, and we make the conference free and all the materials free because we know you're already investing enough in CMMC. So what are the opportunities for improvement? So there's a lot of shortcomings. We've been through a lot of data in this presentation, but there are significant opportunities, and there are some silver linings in kind of the dark cloud, right? Many contractors are aware of the False Claims Act and show a willingness to understand CMMC compliance better. Now, maybe that's forced curiosity, as I think Brian Krebs said a couple of years ago when he keynoted our conference. He talked about defense contractors kind of having forced curiosity about cybersecurity now because of these different requirements, be it CMMC, False Claims Act, whistleblower. There's a high confidence level in SPRS scores that suggests maybe trust in the system in terms of I am willing as a defense contractor to enter a score into the system that I'm confident and I understand. I'm putting a score into a government database. It's kind of like submitting your taxes, maybe would be the analogy, is that you're attesting to something on behalf of your business. And so that seems to imply a level of confidence in trust in the system. And 80% of respondents believe that MSPs, managed security providers, MSSPs, managed security service providers, and technology providers generally should be DFARS certified. We agree completely. Really, if you look at the requirements, one of the, I think, just brilliant things about NIST 800-171, there's so many compliance regimes that don't do much for security. I won't name the ones I'm not a big fan of today. But if you unpack NIST 800-171, it is the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity. It's things like multi-factor authentication, monitoring your network, collecting logs, scanning for vulnerabilities. I mean, these are not revolutionary concepts. And so one of the wonderful things I think about NIST 800-171 and CMMC more broadly is the alignment between actual security and compliance. Very rare that you get that. And again, 80% of respondents thinks that their service provider should meet those requirements as well, and I would agree. So As we look at the kind of, some more of the results, 90% of respondents believe the government should mandate minimum levels of cybersecurity for all federal contracts. And so there was for me, surprising level of support for mandatory minimum cybersecurity regulations. And so the confidence in the ability of DFARS to improve outcomes, that was one of the things we asked the respondents. So do you think DFARS can improve overall IT security, improve national security, supply chain security, overall US competitiveness? Some pretty good results there, north of 60% for everything. And so there seems to be a belief in the defense industrial base that there should be mandatory minimum cybersecurity requirements for doing business with the federal government. And there's a belief that outcomes relative to fewer breaches, better national security will be realized if we implement these mandatory minimum cybersecurity requirements. I mentioned earlier, high level of respondents in the bottom left of the slide believe that their service providers should be certified. And then on the bottom right, one of the things we wanted to ask, because I think one of the struggles for defense contractors over the last several years is, when is this going to be real? The two questions I get most is, how much is this going to cost and how long is it going to take? And so when we did the survey results, we asked respondents, when do you expect final rule to be adopted? And so you can see the spectrum ran from summer of 2024 all the way through never adopted. Very few never adopteds. I think that's not a camp I'd want to be in. What we always say to folks at CyberSheath is that, look, I don't know the exact timing. And in many ways, it doesn't matter. Get started now. Figure out how to start making progress on your journey to compliance, and with an understanding that you're really solving for two problems. You've got the legacy requirement that you probably have the DFARS 7012 or some other clause in your legacy contract, so you need to solve for that. And CMMC is coming. That horse has long been out of the barn, so prepare for that. And it may take you several budget cycles to get to full compliance, but starting now is the only way to get there. And it's that kind of journey of 1,000 miles begins with that first step. And that really is our advice. And we don't pontificate on the timing. We don't kind of pretend to know what is actually unknowable. But what we do know for certain is that starting now is definitely the right thing to do, given where we are in the regulatory cycle for CMMC enforcement. So speaking of enforcement, thinking about SPRS score submissions, one of the things we ask respondents is, when was the last time you submitted your SPRS score, and when do you plan to submit it again? You can see the results there, and a spike in 2022 timeframe, and then a pretty meaningful drop off. So what is clear from the results is that we don't see companies taking an annual approach to SPRS submission. That will need to change, obviously, when CMMC becomes required. But and then obviously, future plans, much higher levels of submission sometime in the future, planned anyway. But we think that's just one, it's required, but it's very important to take that look of your program on an annual basis, particularly if you have open plan of action and milestones. Where am I? Did I do what I said I was going to do when I said I was going to do it? If not, why? Am I budget constrained? Is there some other resource constraint? But it gives you a way to kind of measure yourself on an annual basis. So it's pretty important. Great tool. One of the things I always try and talk to customers about is to say, this can be the tool to have the cybersecurity conversation with your board and your business. Your board, your senior leadership team, whoever your stakeholders are, they understand compliance. It's in every part of the business. It's in engineering, it's in HR, and employment law, it's in finance. There is a compliance requirement throughout the business. And so the business generally, the board generally, your senior leadership team generally will understand compliance. And so compliance is a wonderful way to open the door to a cybersecurity conversation, and you can use that annual SPRS submission to do that. I'd be remiss in this day and age if we didn't do a study and talk about AI. We certainly weren't going to make it a focal point, but given all of the attention that artificial intelligence is getting these days, we wanted to ask at least a question around the planning for AI in businesses over the next 12 months. And so 94% of respondents plan to increase the use of AI over the next 12 months, which is, potentially disheartening when you look at the low levels of implementation of controls like MFA and vulnerability management and patch management. So on one hand, we're adopting and expanding or planning to, very new technologies. And on the other hand, the kind of basic, again, blocking and tackling of cybersecurity, we're still not there. One of the other interesting things is that we wanted to ask about implementation of other actions taken outside of CMMC. And so whether it's denying of TikTok or WeChat or any other technologies. And so 41% of respondents have explicitly denied the use of Huawei, which the FCC designated a national security risk in 2022. 85% had policies and procedures in place if someone in the company is contacted by a foreign intelligence service, which you'd expect from a defense contractor. And so there was a high percentage of contractors who've taken steps to enact policies that aren't explicitly related to CMMC. So again, not all bad news, right? I think, as we saw in the risk slide shared earlier, the defense industrial base largely understands the risks, and as we saw with some of the responses, believe that the DFARS can go meaningfully, a long way to addressing those risks. So as we think about bridging the compliance gap, what we ultimately found was that larger contractors with presumably many, many more resources to address the CMMC challenges were not necessarily more compliant or better at equipped to address those challenges. And so as our technology dependence grows, especially with artificial intelligence and the data just shared, we know that contractors, defense contractors, primes and subs, and I think eventually anybody doing business with the federal government is going to have plans in place to achieve mandatory minimum cybersecurity compliance. I believed that for a long time. Clearly, the respondents believe it as well. And the future of really, I think, an ability from a business perspective to do business with the federal government, it will be a gating function to meet these mandatory minimum cybersecurity requirements. DoD is well over a decade into their journey to mandatory minimum cybersecurity compliance. And so I think what we'll see is other federal agencies follow the DoD's lead. And I think one of the things that doesn't get enough positive credit is just the amazing partnership that the Department of Defense has built with industry. And it truly is probably, I think, one of the best public-private partnerships, particularly in terms of results, and actually making a change to DFARS, putting an audit regime in place, putting an information sharing mechanism in place for, relative to sharing incidents with Defense Cyber Crime Center. I mean, they've just done so much work, DoD and industry, as part of that public-private partnership that can be leveraged across the rest of the federal government. So I think it's a good news story that I think doesn't get enough attention, is that public-private partnership. And so finally, just a little, again, our perspective on this problem. We believe that you really have to solve the whole problem. And so it's great that there's vendors that can kind of give you a license that gets you onto a platform, but that license for whatever the software is doesn't write your system security plan. It's not going to write and maintain a visitor log. It's not going to monitor your network 24/7 without a human being to actually do that. So if you start with licensing, and that's your first kind of foray into CMMC compliance, you're probably going to end up being over licensed and under compliant, which really ultimately means overspending and under complying, which is not where you want to be. So you have to look at it holistically. Sure, you need tools. Absolutely. Don't start with tools, right? You have to bring everything together relative to IT, security, and regulatory compliance, and you have to solve the whole problem. It's 110 to solve the whole problem. It's not 109, it's not -12, it's not anything other than that. So think about the problem holistically and think about, how do I solve the whole problem? Again, IT, cybersecurity, and regulatory compliance. And as far as the timing relative to CMMC 2.0, I don't know. Nobody knows exactly, but it's pretty much here. It's on our doorstep. And so we believe non-compliance will be a deal breaker in your ability to be a contractor with the Department of Defense going forward. So while the exact timing is uncertain, it makes sense to begin the process now and start to think about the people, processes, and technologies you're going to need to achieve full compliance and how you can feather that into multiple budget cycles if that's what you need to do. So we're thrilled to be able to share this research with you today. We hope it's helpful relative to kind of where the defense industrial base is. We think we've answered the question, is bigger better? The short answer is no, relative to this survey results. And hopefully you can maybe use this when you're asked the inevitable question that boards often ask, well, where are we? How do we baseline? How do we compare against other companies? This is a piece of research that we offer to the community for free to be able to help you answer those questions in pursuit of the entire reason we do this, the entire reason we put on this conference, that we put out all these free materials, that we do the ninja training, that we do all of this for free, is to help you get further along in your journey to compliance. I hope we did that today. Thank you so much.
Eric, thank you for that insightful data showing us how DIB contractors are positioned for CMMC compliance today and how organizations can prepare.